So Incineroar is my starter of choice, but I really don't think it's the most competitively viable of the three starters. However, this doesn't mean it's bad, it's just not going to be that headline OU Pokemon that something like Greninja became. It'll be more of a threat in the UU or RU tiers instead. Now, if we look at its typing, I'm very happy that they decided to make it Fire Dark over Fire Fighting. This means that it does still have the three weaknesses from the Fire type, but it only gets the Fighting weakness from the Dark typing. It's not weak to Bug or Fairy, which is very good for it. Its abilities are Blaze and Intimidate, and sadly at the time of making this video, Intimidate hasn't been released yet. But Blaze isn't necessarily a bad ability. Blaze means that if you get to a low amount of HP, your fire attacks will be stronger, which is pretty useful except for the fact that you're very slow. And Intimidate would probably be better, especially if you wanted to set up with Incineroar, but until those abilities are released, we can only imagine. As far as his stats go, he actually has really well-rounded bulk in 95 HP and 90 in both of his defenses. His special attack isn't bad at 80, and his physical attack is quite high at 115, so he'll be doing quite a bit of damage with any attack he decides to throw out. Along with this, his speed is a very crowded tier of 60. He shares it with Primarina, Toucannon, and other Pokemon that really don't like to run speed, so perhaps running just a bit of speed in this Pokemon could help you a lot in a lot of different battles. So the first set I have is just strictly for damage. This is going to be an Adamant Incineroar, Choice Banded, and you can run max attack, and I would actually take out a little more HP than I put here. I would probably do about 240 HP and 12 in speed or so. That way you can outspeed uninvested Celesteela as well, because no Celesteela wants to take a Choice Banded Flare Blitz from an Incineroar. So, looking at your moves, Flare Blitz is your biggest damage move. It's 120 base power, Fire type, physical, and it gets a boost from Blaze if you're low health. So, all these things make it a very scary move to switch in on or to try to take if you're slower than Incineroar. You also have Darkest Lariat as your unique move. It's an 85 base power physical dark type attack, and it ignores your opponent's stat changes. So, if your opponent used something like Z Stockpile and they got +1 defense, or if your opponent likes to set up iron defenses, Darkest Lariat doesn't care. It hits straight through those boosted defenses and will do the base 85 Choice Banded max attack damage, which probably won't really be something to laugh at. I think U-turn is another good move, because if your opponent does want to switch in something like a Primarina, you can always just U-turn out and have a free switch in to something good against what your opponent thought could take a hit from your Incineroar. Your last move could be either Earthquake or Cross Chop. Earthquake is a good move in general to hit steel types, rock types, fire types, a lot of different types that you may not be able to hit very hard otherwise. And Cross Chop does about the same thing, but it's fighting instead of ground, so if you're stuck using Earthquake against a flying type Pokemon, then that's not as good as doing at least some damage with Cross Chop. Other attacks you could carry would be Leech Life to heal yourself, even though it's not Stab. You could run Outrage, even though Dragon is really not a good type to have. Even if you are a Dragon, there are so many fairies running around right now that it's just very hard to run Dragon type moves successfully, other than, say, Draco Meteor. You can also run Shadow Claw if you'd rather run Ghost over Dark, even though you do get Dark type Stab, so really there's not much of a reason to do that. And then you get Throat Chop, which I thought was an interesting move. Right now it's kind of useless because it actually stops your opponents from using sound-based moves for, I believe, 2 or 3 turns. But if this were an earlier meta, this would be extremely useful against Pokemon like Gardevoir and Sylveon, because you could use Throat Chop and suddenly they're unable to use Hyper Voice at all. Now, while this attack isn't useful right now, in the future it actually could be very useful in stopping your obvious counter in Primarina, because once Primarina gets Liquid Voice, it will probably replace Surf, Sparkling Aria, Hydro Pump, or Scald with Hyper Voice, which would be boosted then by Liquid Voice, its hidden ability. So say a Primarina decides to switch in on you, and you use Throat Chop. Well, suddenly their water type stab is nullified for a couple of turns, and they're forced to hit you with something else. And most Primarinas are only carrying Fire Stab, and then either Psychic, Ghost, Ice, or Grass, all of which you resist, other than the Fairy. But you'd still be able to take a Fairy hit much better than you would a water type hit. The only other real set I have for this Pokemon is the Bulky Setup set. And it's a similar idea to a lot of the other bulky sets I had. You would run either Leftovers to keep your health high or a Z-Stone to do a lot of damage. Adamant Nature, max out your HP. In this circumstance, I did max out your special defense so that you can take more special hits that aren't super effective. And then give yourself a little bit of investment in attack. You then run Bulk Up to boost both your physical defense and your physical attack. That way you're bulky on the special defense end from the start, but then you can start increasing your physical defense and your physical attack. From there you just need coverage, and on this particular set I put Darkest Lariat and Flare Blitz for the same reasons we mentioned earlier, as well as Leech Life. That way you can get some health back past your Leftovers. Other moves this Pokemon could run is Flame Charge to help with that fairly abysmal speed stat. You could start building up your speed. You could also run Overheat if there were Pokemon that could wall you for days on the physical side and you just needed to get rid of quickly with an uninvested Overheat. You could also run Will-O-Wisp to nullify your opponent's physical threats, and if you wanted to be more bulky than actually wanting to deal damage. You could run either Swords Dance or Nasty Plot as well. They're both setup moves this Pokemon gets, but I think it benefits a little bit more from Bulk Up than it does from Swords Dance because of its lowered speed. You also use Fake Out, which could be decent in doubles, but really this Pokemon will really shine in doubles once Intimidate is an option, because Intimidate is so good in the VGC format. And the last move it really gets that is of any use to it is Acrobatics. I really couldn't think of many items that could be popped on this Pokemon. Perhaps you could run one of the berries that increase your health by 50% once you're below 25. And you could set up Flame Charges and then be super speedy and have those Acrobatics and other stab moves. But really, that's very situational, and if your opponent wants to knock you out in one hit, they will, because of how common different water types are in this meta. Other sets that are very similar to this that I didn't make full slides for are Assault Vest, Choice Scarf, and even Double Support. It's the same basic idea. You want the Flare Blitz, you want the Darkest Lariat, and then you want some kind of support moves. It doesn't really change much other than that. And that's the worst part of Incineroar in my opinion. Even though it's very strong, its stats are great, and it has a lot of different support options, its options are still fairly limited. It still only has a set amount of things it can do, and this makes it just a little too predictable for my taste.